Hello and welcome to the Broadcast Newswrap, tackling the biggest debates in the world of television. This week, we welcome Zinc's London Director of Television, Greg Sanderson, and freelance writer-director, Sophie Bernberg, to talk being LGBTQ+ in TV. Sophie and Greg reflect on progress made on and off screen, areas for improvement, and we broach the Love Island sexuality debate. All that, plus the ever-popular What We've Been Watching, on this week's Broadcast Newswrap. So today we welcome Sophie Bernberg and Greg Sanderson to discuss LGBTQ+ representation in TV. It's a pleasure to have the two of you on. Thanks so much.
Pleasure to be here.
So just by way of introduction, Greg Sanderson is the director of Zinc Media's London TV labels. He oversees Blakeway, Films of Record, Brook Lapping and Reef. Greg is a former exec producer on the Storyville strand and has overseen numerous factual shows over the years. And Greg also wrote a comment piece for us back in November entitled "Don't Forget TV's LGBTQ+ Community." Sophie Bernberg is a freelance writer-director who has written, directed and produced a number of short films and is also the director of Queering Public Space, which is available on YouTube. She is currently writing a queer TV comedy drama and most recently penned a comment piece for Broadcast entitled "It's Time to Truly Welcome the LGBTQ+ Community," which laid out some of the issues that we're going to speak about today. And both of those comment pieces are really well worth a read if listeners haven't got around to reading them already. So welcome to the two of you. I first just wanted to ask you how you've got to where you've got to, really. So Sophie, maybe if you want to go first.
So I basically always really wanted to direct films. When I was kind of like younger, I was into drama and directed plays at school and things like that. And then before I went to university, I was kind of like thinking, do I go to film school or, do I do an English lit degree? Because I'm also like a writer, a screenwriter as well. And I decided to do English lit. And then I thought, I could always do film school afterwards. And so then after graduating, I basically got work experience at a production company in Soho and was just doing that, like picking up stuff, really enjoying it. Kind of like, just took my camera along to stuff and made little like content films or whatever. That's really how I just got into directing, just doing it myself. And I did do short film courses as well. But yeah, that's how I got into that.
Great. And how about yourself, Greg?
Mine sounds a lot less purposeful than Sophie's. In that I was a professional singer before I got into telly, and I was getting tired of that life and trying to work out what the hell I wanted to do, and met a fabulous producer called Kate Solomon at my sister's house party. And she started talking about what she did, and I thought that sounds cool. And her boss was Malcolm Brinkworth at Touch Productions at that point, and she said you should meet Malcolm, and he offered me a traineeship. So I fell into TV completely accidentally, have no qualifications in it whatsoever. So then I worked at Touch for a couple of years, stayed in the West Country, went and worked at Flashback TV with Sam Morgan, and then went in-house at the BBC. And then somehow, I'm never quite sure how this happened, ended up stepping over to Storyville as commissioner, and then had 10 years of commissioning. So then moved into arts commissioning, arts music commissioning. And then 5 years ago, thought time for a change and shifted into the indie sector. And that's how I ended up at Zinc, initially running Brook Lapping, and now, as you say, sitting across the London labels. Also including Super Collider, by the way, recently launched. Don't forget.
Missed off Super Collider. I can't believe it. Thanks so much. That's really good introductions. So Sophie, I wanted to start with you actually to talk a little bit about your comment piece for us. And one of the things it discussed was the need for TV to better portray queer spaces. Can you elaborate a bit on what you meant?
It's really important to have those spaces because then people who aren't queer are able to kind of, see how queer people live.
Point of TV is to open up new worlds, right? And I think I agree with Sophie that the the benefit of showing more queer spaces on TV is that is stopping otherizing. Sorry, horrible word, but it makes people realize that just because of who we fancy or who we have sex with, not necessarily different, and sort of can demythologize, I guess, is what you can do, and that's what TV does at its best in all areas. I don't know if you agree with that, Sophie.
Yeah, I completely agree. And by seeing, seeing people live as they are, and showing them like authentically, I think that's also really good because, you know, you're not demonizing people.
No big broad question here, but what would either one of you say is the kind of current state of play with on-screen LGBTQ representation in the UK specifically, I'd say?
It's really hard to generalize, right? And since I wrote that piece, It's a Sin came out and was massive and did a massive job of on-screen representation. But I just have this slight feeling, and I think that came across in my piece, that it feels a bit sort of tokenistic. And I think that's a danger of all representation, actually. I think once you feel you have to represent something, you know, I know the commissioning mindset is, God, we must get something that does that. It's not yet ingrained in the culture, I don't think, of TV, that, you know, actually the best way to do it is not think about sexuality, but particularly, but just cast a diverse range of people and sexuality will come into it. But I think at the moment, and I wrote this in the piece, and it's absolutely no offense to Sue Perkins or Claire Balding or Graham, they're all fantastic at what they do. But it's sort of, it tends to be, right, okay, we've got Sue's on screen, that's our lesbian quotient covered. And then they sort of don't think about it anymore. And I think that, you know, that's probably a bit unfair in some cases, but that can be how it feels. And I think that's what comes across when you watch.
Do you think, cause it's been 6 months since you wrote that piece for us, and there is, of course, we've discussed on this podcast many times this enormous diversity push that is taking place at the moment and has been taking place for like the past year. So have you, bar It's a Sin, which I think we'll talk about a bit later, have you seen other signs of improvement in this way?
Not particularly, but obviously TV is a slow process, so I wouldn't expect to. What I can say is I had quite a lot of reaching out from various people across the industry after that piece saying, thanks, that sort of reminded us. And some defensively saying, of course, we thought about it, we just haven't said it so much, but that's what you'd expect. But yeah, so I mean, I'm optimistic, but I think it's a tricky circle to square or square to circle. I don't think it's there's one easy solution. I think what I was trying to do is just remind people that, you know, LGBTQ plus was not really part of any of the diversity dialogue that I saw over that whole diversity push. And I think it was really important that it should be.
Yeah, and I was going to bring up, because one of the things that you mentioned, Greg, was about we'd been writing quite a bit about the BBC's inclusion policy at the time, and now the BBC has these targets. So 20% people behind the camera have to either be BAME or from a working class background or be disabled. But you kind of highlighted the fact that LGBTQ plus wasn't included in this policy. I don't know if you could elaborate on that a little bit. Like, do you think that is something that should be included? Or is it a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complicated than that?
I think that's a tricky one. I mean, personally, I don't massively believe in quotas anyway. I think it needs cultural change rather than quotas, and I think they're a really blunt instrument. So I'm not sure I would go with that. But I don't understand the rationale for some protected categories being included and some not. I feel like if you're including protected categories, then all of them should be included. And if you're doing it on a sort of percentage of population basis, which that claims to be, then I don't see why it shouldn't be.
Yeah, no, I think it was it shouldn't have been left off, and I think if that was an oversight, you know, maybe it just reflects the fact that maybe, like, you know, behind the scenes there aren't as many queer people, you know, because if you had queer people there who were like making those, then they would say, oh, you know, LGBTQIA plus, you know, people.
Yeah, I think it reflected something that a brilliant head of diversity once said to me, and she's a fantastic person. And I was like, oh, you've got a diversity fund, can I apply for that? And she's like, not really, if it doesn't show, it doesn't count. To which I responded, should I wear a gay badge? And it sort of reflects that kind of, and I think we'll come on to this, but like reflects that sense of, you're fine now, you can get married, you're out in the open, do we have to worry about you? And which is a really basically ignorant way of understanding what life is like in the community.
Yeah. And also showing that, you know, that people think that there's one particular way to be gay or be queer that's very stereotypical, I think.
Kind of off the back of that, it's often kind of perceived, I think, in TV that it has this kind of like liberal pass, say that it kind of gets away with it without having to do too much more because there's on-screen representation and there's gay people behind the camera. But would you agree that, like, it's kind of made people not try as hard in this one area? Yeah,
I mean, one of the things I get most often is that everyone on TV is gay. What's the problem? Actually, not remotely true, in fact, for TV. It's still a tiny proportion. But there absolutely is that perception of kind of like, you know, it's a very liberal, probably higher proportion of gay, straight, queer people in it than some industries, therefore it's fine. So yeah, I think people do absolutely give themselves a liberal pass. And actually, as I say, it comes from not really understanding, there's still plenty of people that are persecuted for their sexuality in this country, and people are still beaten up every day. And I think because that's, frankly, the mainstream media doesn't report that much. I think there's a kind of complacency. So you're kind of like, well, I guess if the makeup of our staff is kind of fine, we're probably doing it. I think there is a bit of laziness around that thought, and I think that does exist, yeah.
I wondered if the two of you, do you feel like you've experienced quite a lot of prejudice over the years? I don't know whether there have been sort of specific examples, or maybe more generalized, like microaggressions. Like, is that something that you felt on a day-to-day basis?
So I haven't actually, but I've kind of like known people who have, so it is a thing. Sometimes on set it's quite an intense environment, and if that kind of thing happens, then like who do you report it to? There's often not anyone to report it to as well.
I think I have, though. I think most of it's been inadvertent rather than deliberate. I can't think of many deliberate cases where it's been sort of weaponized. But I mean, there was one famous channel controller meeting, and I won't name any names, obviously, which had been between BBC Radio and BBC TV, and it was unusual that they should be working in concert, frankly. And at the end, the channel controller said, "Oh, let's all hold hands and like sing Kumbaya." Oh no, that would be gay. I actually just said, "And what would be the problem with that?" But things like that where you sometimes see the inbuilt prejudice, and maybe that's just a schoolyard use of a term, but I don't think it's one that should be used in the corridors of the BBC. And similarly, just moments, I went for dinner with some really good friends at the BBC once, and they sort of just started. They got fascinated by the practicalities of gay sex, and I was basically quizzed for about an hour on it. I don't object to that because it's friends, but it's that kind of thing is absolutely the otherizing or whatever that I think should probably be avoided. I mean, in that case, I didn't mind, as I say, because they're friends, but that sort of thing does happen quite a lot.
Do you feel like safe and supported by the industry, or like by the broadcasters, or when you're working on set? Do you feel you were talking before obviously about how much violence and kind of hate crimes are directed? Do you feel like there's those people around you that could maybe step in if anything came up, or do you feel like you're kind of alone in that?
Well, in that particular case of the channel controller meeting, actually my boss at the time stepped in and made a formal complaint. So I definitely felt supported then, although also, caused quite a lot of hassle, and I'd prefer that not to have happened. I don't know, that's a tricky conundrum, because you also don't want to feel patronized or like you can't look after yourself. So it's not something you sort of seek out. But actually, I've always found TV, once you're within an organization or a company, to be a really supportive place. I'm lucky I've avoided most of the horrible politics and everything else. So yeah, I would say I generally have done.
I'd say as a freelancer, actually, I think it's a lot harder, because as a freelancer, you're relying on people getting you jobs and being friendly to them, and then they'll get you on another job. So it's like if you were to say something about a producer or a member of crew, like the consequences to your career can be quite bad. And, like Greg was saying before, like, I think there is a bit of a liberal pass with people thinking that it's all okay. Like, we've got rights in this country, so therefore we're all okay. And maybe, like, I think maybe people don't think that they can really step forward and say something if something was going to happen.
Yeah, and I think I should say, I've been lucky. I've been relatively senior in the industry for quite a while, so I'm less likely to experience prejudice and less likely to be sort of hit with it. Whereas certainly, I think lower in the industry, particularly in freelance, as Sophie says, where you're utterly dependent on the people above you for your job, really hard to speak out and say, it's a structural problem, right, with how the industry works. But I mean, it would be impossible, I think, if you were uncomfortable with the tone of voice of an exec when you were a researcher, then it would be really, really bloody hard to say anything about it.
Exactly.
And there's so much talk about this at the moment, isn't there? Especially with regards freelancers. Is that something that you feel like is improving, Sophie, or has it just sort of like plateaued out?
It's improving in the sense that I think that, like, when I started in the industry, it was quite hard as a young woman. I don't know. I think, like being taken seriously was, it's quite difficult. But I think that it is getting better because people are talking about the fact that it's not okay to talk to a person like this, or, whatever, like, because it's being talked about more, people in the back of their heads, friends of mine are thinking, oh, like, I actually can't say this, or I can't act like this, because if I do, there'll be consequences. Whereas, kind of like however many years ago, there weren't those consequences.
I mean, I think there are improvements here. I mean, I'm not doing a puff piece for Zinc, but I've worked really hard, and it's helpful because they've got me as MD and Emma Hindley as a creative director, two fairly prominent queer people in the industry. That when researchers have felt uncomfortable with other members of the team and how they speak, and it's normally speaking out of ignorance, right, about not knowing the correct terminology and not knowing that's offensive, because God, it's hard enough for us to keep up with the terminology and be correct. The people have felt that they can say it actually, and they either say it to the execs' faces or they say it to me and I say it back to them, and actually we've realized there aren't ramifications, and actually everyone's normally mortified and go, God, sorry, I've messed that up. So I think those kind of feedback loops, and I'm sure that's true in other companies as well, are getting better. I think probably harder on specific productions. Again, as Sophie was saying, as freelancer, I think it's much, much harder to do that. But when you're staff, say in a development team, it's a bit easier.
Sophie, in your piece, you talked, which I found really interesting, you talked about kind of other departments being included in this decision or have training, say, and an awareness in order to improve representation, but also avoid stereotypes. So you mentioned kind of production design and location. And I thought it's quite interesting. I wondered if you could elaborate on that just a little bit more.
I think like with when you're making a program like about queer people, it's important to either have queer people, behind the scenes who actually have that lived experience, or it's, ideally, like if there was like some training or something, because those worlds that we kind of like portray.
Well, they're kind of hidden, aren't they, to some people, as you were saying earlier on about the lack of queer experiences. So if you have a straight production designer trying to design a gay club, you're quite likely to resort to stereotypes.
Exactly.
Which I think, coming back to It's a Sin, is why that was so brilliant, because the crew were all, I think, entirely or largely LGBTQ as well, and that really shone through, because the authenticity of that, I think, is what grabbed people, and it just was noticeably different from the show. I mean, can't prove it negative, but I think it's noticeably different from a show that wouldn't have had that.
Completely, because it's almost like, that in It's a Sin, for example, like their apartment was a character in itself, throughout the show that, evolved, and I think you can tell that it's that it's authentic and it has been made like that.
And weirdly, the only character I think he didn't quite work as well as the others was the straight woman.
She didn't have any dates.
The experience wasn't lived. Yeah,
exactly.
And there's also been moving from kind of drama to reality. A big debate that's really raging at the moment within our industry is that of reality shows and whether they should have same-sex couples or couples from across the LGBTQ plus spectrum. So this comes from some comments made by an ITV commissioner a couple of weeks ago about Love Island, which were picked up sort of across the board by the national newspapers, where she described logistical difficulties in having non-heterosexual couples on Love Island, or non-heterosexual contestants. And Hannah wrote a piece earlier this week about a new Channel 4 show, 5 Dates a Week, which is opening up, so sort of doing the reverse, opening up that show to people of various sexual orientations. So I wondered what you guys thought about this. Really, maybe you, Greg, first. Should LGBTQ plus couples be allowed to appear on Love Island, or is ITV's approach kind of fair to this?
I mean, I don't believe that. I totally see how it could make the format more complicated. My TV brain goes, "Oh God, how would you do that with Love Island?" But then I think it's a creative industry and people should be able to find ways around it. And really, I guess the question of this is, what was the intent behind that comment? Was it sheerly a practical, logistical one, or was actually it's not going to work so well for the ITV2 audience, so we don't want to do it? And it's very hard to discern that, frankly. But it shouldn't be impossible. I don't think it should be done sometimes for the sake of it. So I found the Strictly debate really complicated. So I'm like, well, ballroom dancing is generally between a man and a woman. So why would we co-opt that for the sake of LGBTQ plus representation? But then actually when they did it with Nick Adams, it was fabulous. So I was probably wrong on that. And I think, in some formats, it fits perfectly. First Dates, I was delighted when that started having gay couples on it, because you're like, yeah, of course, why not? That's exactly what Sophie was talking about at the beginning, which is when you see couples going on dates, queer people date pretty similarly to straight people most of the time, and it worked perfectly well in the format.
Completely right. I think First Dates is a really good example of a show that does this really well. as discussed. What about you, Sophie? What did you think of the Love Island debate?
I agree with Greg that, that if you think about it, from a production point of view, yes, there would be some changes that you would need to make. But I think the fact that, saying it in a public forum, that it would present logistical difficulties, I think that as a queer person, that just would make you feel kind of like, am I difficult? I don't think that was the right thing to say. I think, you should resolve that problem, before you say anything, maybe think okay, so am I going to do this or am I not? Or are you going to make another show, just with queer people?
I agree. It's pretty tone deaf, although I have some sympathy having sat on those panels in the past and said stuff. I know you guys are lurking out in the background trying to get a headline out of it. It is quite a nerve-wracking process.
Yeah.
So it's easy to make a mistake. The other thing I'd say on this is I do think it's really important for gay couples to be integrated into mainstream programs. I think there's a real danger that you fill your gay quota by doing niche programs that only the community watch. And that's sort of, again, back to my initial point, that's not the point of TV. It's about broadening horizons, not catering to little silos, I think.
I wanted to talk actually on lesbian representation quite quickly. And it's one thing that I have always really noticed as an audience member, that there's a lot less representation. And like you were saying, Greg, in that ordinary, into ordinary TV. So I was thinking of shows like Come Dine With Me, or I think even sometimes First Dates falls to that often, that there's definitely that balance isn't quite addressed. And I wondered if maybe either of you could speak to that.
I would say that's a good point, actually, because I think it is maybe in our kind of, on TV, that maybe gay men are more represented than gay women, and that maybe there needs to be just a little bit more of a push there. I think that there are some great programs that you have already. So for example, there's Feel Good with Mae Martin, which recently came out, which is brilliant. She's a comedian, and then she did this show, and that's all about two women falling in love, British show. So, I think we just need more shows like that. And I think it's about, commissioners being open to those stories, which I think increasingly they are.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And you do struggle to think of examples, I think. Mm-hmm. Whereas I can never remember the name of the program with Ian McKellen and Derek Jacobi, but obviously, that's a pure gay men show, great show. I can't think of a lesbian equivalent of that anywhere. Mm-hmm. And it's not like, Miriam Margolyes a national treasure. Why does she not have a sitcom with someone doing a lesbian couple? It just never really happens. And I think that's partly because whilst there aren't as many gay commissioners in TV as you'd think there are gay men commissioners in TV, there are even fewer gay women commissioned in TV. In fact, I'm really struggling to think of any. Obviously, I don't know them all. But yeah, and I think ultimately that kind of representation on screen comes from awareness behind the screen, and particularly at the commissioning level. Mm. And I think that's what, ultimately that's how things change, right? You have to have the commissioners commissioning the stuff. And it's not great having, I can imagine after this, someone listens and Needed goes down going, shit, we need to get a lesbian sitcom, which would probably be commissioned by a straight woman or a straight man or a gay man.
Well, hopefully this can be the start of something fantastic new sitcom. Leading on from that, intersectionality is such a big topic at the moment, and we talk about it across all diversity strands. I wondered if you feel like TV commissioners have got to grips with the intersectional nature of the LGBTQ plus community.
So I think we're making a lot of progress, in general culture, in terms of intersectionality. And it's often for kind of bigger institutions and things that they often need to catch up. Maybe not yet, but I think it's getting there, and I think because it is as you were saying, there has been such a big push in the last 6 months for that intersectionality in television, that really, the fact that people are actually really talking about it and really want this to happen is a great thing. And it can only really get better from there.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's slow progress, but even the very fact we're recording this podcast shows that there is some kind of progress, right? There's an industry-wide magazine. TV is a really slow-moving industry, I think, as you can see with BAME representation. We've been talking about that for the last 15 years, and still not much has happened.
I thought, why we have you both, I thought it might be nice. I mean, you've mentioned a few good examples, Feel Good and It's a Sin, but I thought if there were any other shows that you guys have been watching lately that you think has really nailed it.
For me, it would be Pose. It's one of my favorite shows of all time. It's brilliant in the fact that it's got such a diverse cast, and most of them are, most of the cast are LGBTQ plus, playing queer characters. It's just brilliantly written, and it shows, it's certainly like 80s and 90s, also shows that kind of time and what like a massive change there was in terms of like, kind of attitudes towards queer people in that time. So that would be a really, I think that's done it just incredibly. It's a brilliant show.
That's a fantastic show, and I'm so pleased. I'm really glad that the UK got to see that show, because maybe it's on Netflix now, but it was on the BBC iPlayer for a while. It feels like it's really important for the UK to have that window into US culture almost.
So I think Transparent is one that really nailed it. Managed to combine great drama. Just the fact that the character was trans was just part of the setup, and it was completely integrated. And I thought that was fantastic. And it sounds really obvious, but the reboot of Queer Eye was done so brilliantly, and just reminded us, that talking of that intersection between the guy who had the skin complaint and